Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. Now, one of the things that we focus on heavily when it comes to the PAS report is our education system, because without an education system, a country will not succeed or survive. But what happens when you have over $1 trillion tax dollars spent each and every year on an education system that has completely failed? And I'm bringing back a great guest on the show. He's been on before, Wilfred Reilly, professor, and he just has a new book that was released, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And it's such an important book. I suggest everyone go out and read it. I'll have links up at the PAS Report website. Wilfred, how are you today?
Doing very well. Good to be back on the show, man.
Well, I'm always glad to have you on because I always enjoy discussing the issues with you, particularly when it comes to your books, because I think that you highlight the dramatic problems within our education system. And just to start right off, you wanted to tackle the myths head on of what students are learning in the classroom. So can you just give us an example of a few of these myths and how they're not true?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so like a brief piece of intro first. The book, as you mentioned, is called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And it's a response to this entire genre of books. Lies My Teacher Told Me is the obvious one from Lowen back in 1995, but also People's History of the United States from Howard Zinn. The 1619 Project just released a book. It's a sort of a Black history of America. There's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is a native history of America, so on. And all these books, the way I usually phrase it in kind of like the dinner speech for this is that they make two claims. The first is that Western culture is really, really, really bad, probably the worst. We had slaves, we broke treaties with the Native Americans who were, as I noted in one chapter, peaceful people who spent all day in dancing and making love. This is the storyline. We abused women, so on down the line. How can this ever be forgiven? Colonialists. And the second message is kind of like, well, we are the edgy rebels that are telling you this. I mean, Howard Zinn openly, as I recall, identifies as a Marxist, describes himself as a rebel, as a radical. And even if you look at textbooks in secondary school or in college, as you know, you'll see this sort of thing. Like there's a little graphic in the corner that's headlined something like, your parents probably don't know that much about feminism. And so you have this very widespread narrative, like this is the rebel truth about your country, and we're getting it out there to you, and your country is really bad. And what struck me as I was looking at this is that it's sort of like people claiming to be in the resistance when they're in the government. Like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are from the center left of the Democratic Party and are running the country. What struck me about this was that most of these books are the textbooks that are used in prep schools and in colleges. I mean, I've been assigned two of the books I just mentioned over the years. So I had an issue with the entire narrative. Like, first of all, if you look at Western history in context, the West is no worse than any other human culture and is probably better. So one of the points that I make in the book is that slavery, for example, wasn't an American institution that just affected blacks. It was something that endured for all of history. So that many of the poor whites that came to the USA were at least indentured servants, but that more to the point, you had a massive Arab slave trade, you had a gigantic Latin American slave trade, you had a black and Muslim slave trade in whites, the Barbary slave trade, and so on. So first, we're no worse than anybody else. Better, in fact, best society in history. But also, the narrative that's being presented as fringe and radical is the mainstream. So I wanted to look at what these modern texts and these modern books that are the teaching materials used in schools say, and whether that's true, as opposed to continuing to pretend that this is 1950 and we're reading like Rudyard Kipling and Teddy Roosevelt and so on in the classroom. And what I found, to kind of get to the point and answer your question, there are a lot of mainstream narratives, like natives were peaceful, slavery was a unique Western and white sin, My favorite is the Red Scare was just sort of a panic that caught no communists. We just, for some reason, started freaking out about the Russians. People still use the term McCarthyism as a pejorative. Most of these claims, white flight was entirely baseless. People just left ethnic neighborhoods because of bigotry that had nothing to do with crime or with the riots in the 1960s. All of these things are incorrect. So I wrote a book that's kind of from the center right, very quantitative, that just pointed some of this stuff out. Like none of this is true. These were the annual life expectancy in most native societies was 28. This sort of thing. And it's been pretty well received so far.
You wrote about something that always fascinates me when it comes to the left-wing lies and myths that exist out there. And one of the things you do is you destroy the whole Southern strategy myth. And I want to talk to you about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you prepared for the unexpected? As a former emergency manager, being prepared is not a choice, it's a necessity, and that's where the Wellness Company comes in. Imagine having the peace of mind that you're equipped to handle any medical crisis, from tick bites to the latest pandemic. The Wellness Company's medical emergency kit is your lifeline, packed with essential medications like ivermectin, emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and more. This kit is your ultimate preparedness solution. The Wellness Company's team of renowned medical professionals, including Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. James Thorpe, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and more. They are truth-seeking doctors, and they have designed a kit that sets the gold standard for safety and prevention. Don't wait for the next crisis to strike. Visit twc.health/PAS and use promo code PAS for an exclusive 10% discount just for being a listener of this show. Prepare today, rest easy tomorrow. Use code PAS at checkout. Welcome back, everyone. So, Wilfred, you talk about the whole Southern strategy myth, and I always found this fascinating because when it comes to the idea of race, we keep hearing that the Southerners became Republicans because they're racist. And that's not really true, now is it? Can you elaborate to the audience how this is a myth? I mean, when we look at race, it wasn't really about race, a little bit, because you had blacks moving out to places like Chicago, and you had to be a Democrat in Chicago. You couldn't be registered as a Republican. And the majority of Republicans supported the Civil Rights Act. In fact, if it wasn't for them, the Civil Rights Act would have never passed because the majority of Democrats voted against it. So can you elaborate on this for the audience?
So the idea of the Southern strategy making the South Republican is basically that you often hear that the parties switched on civil rights. And by the way, I will say, since I usually vote Republican, the reason people feel that it's necessary to bring this narrative forward is that the Democrats historically were terrible on civil rights. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan in the South was the militant arm of the Democratic Party. And if you read books like Negroes with Guns, there was almost a low-level war between that group and sort of the black working class and those whites generally in the cities that voted Republican. I mean, there were gun battles and this sort of thing. I mean, quite a few people were killed. So the KKK was a democratic movement by and large, to the extent we want to make it partisan at all. The Republicans were specifically founded to oppose slavery and then to pursue for 15 to 20 years Reconstruction policies. And this continued on for quite a while. I mean, in the 1960s, mid 1960s, more Republicans than Democrats in hard number terms with similar sized parties voted for the Civil Rights Act. So when presented with that history, what people on the left-wing debaters will often say is, yeah, okay, sure, but the party switched in the 1960s. The South became Republican because Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and racist whites began to migrate into the Republican Party. And what you find if you actually look at history is that it's a lot more complicated than that, to the extent where that narrative just is wrong. The Dixiecrats in the South in 48 and 64, for example, were an offshoot of the Democratic Party. Their name is kind of a combination of Democrat and Dixie, which is an old regional term for the South. So that in and of itself had nothing to do with conservatism. And even from that point forward, what you actually saw following the passage of the Civil Rights Act, you're right, there was some partisan shift, more than 5%, that's arguably due to racism. But what you also saw was a massive change in the composition and population of the South, one, and two, a period of decades before the South started voting Republican. So the congressional
that I always find fascinating because when you look at state legislative houses, when you look at the governorships from 1960, 70, and 80, it really wasn't until the mid 1990s that Republicans actually solidified a hold on the South.
Yeah, and even then, Bill Clinton won some southern states. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, you have a process that takes like 30 years. I mean, Kevin Williamson of National Review once said, well, if you're making the racism argument, things move slow in the South, but not that slow. But that doesn't make any sense. I mean, most of the old Dixiecrats stayed Democrats until they died. So that's one thing. But another thing also is that something I talk about in the book is that these non-sexy, very pedestrian forces often shape society a lot more than race, class, the things we're kind of supposed to be interested in. So, one of the things that we've seen during the past 40 years in the American South is that population growth in the USA overall has focused on that region and on the West. So, one of the big trends in our society has been people leaving the quote unquote Rust Belt, which means Detroit, Cleveland, Gary, Pittsburgh, all that, and going to the Sun Belt, to these pretty Austin, Nashville, these southern cities where the races aren't fighting anymore. You can buy land for a reasonable price. And that is the thing that most of the serious quants that I looked at really thought affected voting patterns in the South. You had these young executives from the North that at one point might have summered on the quote unquote redneck Riviera, or gone down there for some fishing or something, but weren't going to live in the pre-air conditioning, racial tension South. And a decade or two later, actually moving there. So you can track, and I try to in the chapter, I think I do a pretty good job. You can track voting patterns in the South as you track migratory patterns to the South, like people just going there and living there. And southern cities would very specifically target this kind of migration. I mean, Atlanta was the city too busy to hate. They were running real estate ads in the airport, like, don't you like it down here? In the winter, are you ready to go back to New York or Buffalo, Chicago? So, I mean, that was the thing. The population demographics of the South shifted radically. And you saw a slow partisan transition that largely matched that. Another thing that I don't focus on as much because it's harder to quantify, but the Republicans also moved to the right under and following Reagan and began presenting a lot of policies that the average Southern guy liked more than the Democratic policies. So again, there's this very simple reality in the room. I mean, how's the average Southern Baptist going to vote when it comes to abortion, for example? Okay, well, which party puts that on the table? How do you feel about the troops? Well, okay, who was in power when we won Gulf War I, and so on down the line. So it's a complex picture with racism maybe playing a 5% role. I made that number up, but it's probably about right. It's one of many variables, but it's not in the top 3 or 4. And I kept finding that throughout the book. And I've honestly found that through all of my work over the years, that these things like Black performance in schools will just be attributed to racism, and you'll show up. And I'm from a very diverse neighborhood growing up. I mean, Irish, Italian, Black, Anglo, I guess the white wouldn't be the correct way, but Mexican, so on. And it struck me looking at similar academic issues for all these groups in many cases that there's a lot more at play here. And that's what I've almost always found. And that's what I found in the context of the South.
Yeah, and you've been largely outspoken about that, particularly when you look at the idea of economics, that a lot of it comes down to socioeconomic status as well as the family structure. And you pointed out on numerous occasions, Asians routinely outperform every single other demographic because of these two things. But these myths that you bring up, they've been propagated in our schools for decades. It's not like it just happened in the last 5 years with the emergence of George Floyd and all that. It's been for decades. What is the intent behind propagating these myths?
I mean, I think that the intent is to shape young people's minds so they want to radically change our society. And I don't go into some of the more hardcore, almost conspiracy theories here. The goal is to destroy America, people working as external agents. I tend to think that you should rarely invoke evil as the cause of phenomena when other things like stupidity and partisanship are just available right there on the shelf. But I think that over the past 60 years, we've seen an extremely bizarre migration in statistical terms into education and into media. And that's reflected in terms of the ideas that are now presented in those fields. So in 2004, and I don't think they expected to get this result, Pew Research surveyed American national media figures to see how many leaned left and how many leaned right. And what they found was that the percentage that leaned right was 7%. That includes conservatives, libertarians, I think right of center. And by definition, everyone else was a liberal, which was the main category they looked at, a Marxist, or a left leaning moderate. And I say left leaning because their follow up questions, again, dealing with abortion, taxes, so on down the line. And as I understand, that's been replicated a few times since. And you can do similar analyses in academia, and people have.
I think
I wrote a piece.
anthropology is like 64 to 1 or 64 to
Oh, yeah.
0. Sociology is about 50 to 1. Political science isn't too bad. It's only about 14 to 1.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's pretty crazy. But I mean, like the some of them, like sociology, actually, not to correct that, that's a correct figure from like 2 years ago. But sociology is 108 to 1, as we've seen some retirements. When I looked at the data earlier this year, yeah, political science 14 to 1. The friendliest field to conservatives is economics, where it's only 4.5 to 1. So you've only got 4 or 5 Democrats or communists for every Republican in economics, which has traditionally been a very conservative field. I think we've all seen how, the Laffer curve has done versus Marxism, but like that has an impact. So there's a conversation to be had about how that happened. I mean, was it
Well, I want to
intentional?
ask you about that because when we
Yeah.
look at academia, I mean, listen, when I went to college, there were far left professors. There were some avowed Marxists on the college campus, but they didn't necessarily push their ideology on the student body. And they actually encouraged discussion in the classroom. They loved to have the debates, but they would teach and they were subject matter experts. It
Mhm.
seems like over the last 20 years, professors and teachers in the K through 12 system lost something that they're no longer experts in the field and they're filling that void with their ideology. Are you seeing the same thing?
Oh yeah, you see that from time to time, certainly. Now, I do think that most professors, certainly if you're a Democrat instead of communist, are reasonably ethical in the sense of you tell your students to read different perspectives and so on. I've had classes where I gave them extra credit points if they subscribe to any real newspaper, and that could be the Washington Times or the Washington Post. Like I don't really care. That sort of thing is common, but I do think that it matters that the disparity is so remarkable. Like, have you ever read the attitudinal model?
I have.
Yeah. Yeah, the old Siegel and Spaeth classic. The thing that's interesting about that book is that they would never say something along the lines of morality is not real. These are these staid older scientists. But what they find is that the decisions of solo leaders, especially males, can be predicted, whatever it was, 92%, just by knowing their political party, knowing the partisan affiliation of the appointing president for judges. And I've never done a massive follow-up of this using modern methods, but I would assume that's true in most fields. That in almost every arena, there's normally a split between liberals, conservatives, moderates, and there tend to be kind of theories of life that you're more likely to hold if you are a conservative, and theories of life that you're more likely to hold if you're a liberal. A conservative might be a traditional Catholic in the Jesuit tradition. A liberal might be a moderate feminist or something like that. And what we've got in higher education right now is all liberals. So every theory that everyone hears comes from the left side of the aisle. I remember I was recently invited to submit work to a new journal. It's a pretty good journal. Not going to name it, but they've done a good job so far. But it was just like your work can come you can come from the perspective of like liberalism, leftism, Marxism, Maoism, feminism. It just went on, and they skipped like conservatism and libertarianism totally because it didn't occur to them that there would be people writing from those perspectives. So I think that's the issue. Like you've seen this real consolidation in these fields, and it affects what gets printed, what gets published. Like last point on this, but I mean, almost every article in sociology kind of focuses on the theme of where can we find racism against minorities or sexism against women. And that's actually a quote from the sociologist Rod Grant, who was a sparring partner of mine, but an interesting guy. But the reality is that it would be just as easy in the affirmative action era to find sexism against men or racism against whites. It's about 50-50. The country's 60% white and 40% minority. Nobody's looking for the answer to the second question. So what you wind up with is this entirely one-sided discourse and conversation. And yeah, I think that's an issue. And I think that issue is worsening. I don't think teachers are less ethical than they were in the 80s. Probably more so when it comes to like affairs with students in college or drinking on the job or something. But I think that they are far more partisan. I mean, 18% of social science professors are Marxists.
Well, it's a debt spiral, and I want to talk to you about that when we get back. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, I was talking about the debt spiral when it comes to the education system. And what I mean by debt spiral is that you have an education system that breeds ignorance, and then they're going to go and create the next generation of teachers. So the students that never got the subject matter expertise to begin with are now going to be the ones to go in the classroom and teach the students, despite them lacking some fundamental knowledge in the subject field. At the same time, they're going to substitute ideology for the subject material that they don't know or don't grasp well. And then they're going to teach the myths that they were taught to the next generation.
No, I think that's exactly correct. And that's like these ideas. What I notice actually is that the ideas that my generation thought of as fringe are now thought of as mainstream. And that's unless we really strike back with like the U, Austin, and so on, and actual governors penalized, limiting what you can teach at some of these institutions and so on. That's pretty likely to intensify. So when I was in college, like you would hear about reparations or wages for housework or something like that. If you went on a date with someone from one of the arts fields that smoked clove cigarettes and you were, interested enough in them as a person to listen to this babble, it was a very fringe perspective. Almost all of this, like openly being a communist, which is what a Marxist is, that stuff existed. It was on the campus. But, so were the ROTC guys and so on. It was not a normal thing people talked about in normal life, if that makes sense. Today, I mean, you've got the state of California where they never had slaves voting to pay reparations. So as you take ideas and you move them to the mainstream, like Judith Butler's gender theory is where the idea of transgenderism comes from to some extent. If you're talking about anything other than a pure mental health diagnosis, that in the 70s and 80s was a fairly fringe party kid thing. You would see the pride and trans flags and like the closing credits of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it was a thing. It was a youth subcultural big city thing to know what those even were. Now that's transited to the absolute mainstream where they're on light poles during June for the entire month. So I don't think that the national mood has shifted very much at all. We're still a center-right country. But these ideas are now known to almost everyone so that ordinary people have to ethically engage them and so on. I think that's going to intensify.
Well, and so speaking to that, how do we stop that intensification? I mean, how do we begin to truly make changes, reform the system? And I'm not saying bring it to a conservative point of view. I'm just saying bring it back to the point of normalcy where many people are.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that I always say is that normal people need to start being honest. So I did a poll once on Twitter. The Gad Sad, who's a hilarious writer as well as a good academic, in one of his books said something like, "We've convinced people to believe lunacy, including the fact that some women have 9-inch penises." And I was actually curious, and it's just funny and somewhat crude, but I was actually curious about whether people believed this. Like what percentage of people had accepted, fairly intense trans ideology as real? So, I mean, I went on my Twitter account, my X account, and I linked a SurveyMonkey poll. You should still be able to find this on there. And I asked people, do you believe that some women have 9-inch penises? Like I quoted him. It was like sad, 2022 made this claim. And I have a fairly quote unquote bro audience for obvious reasons, but everyone's like feminist girlfriend or their wife is on there. I expected it to be about 30%, yes, I do, and 70%, no, I don't. And it was actually 2%, yes, I do, and 98%, no, I don't. None of the feminist women, business women, etc., believe this stuff either. And I think that's pretty common. So I guess the point would be step one when you're confronting crazy ideas. I think the idea that we should lock down all of society for a virus with a fatality rate of 0.4% if you don't take care of yourself, that was an insane idea.
I would concur with that.
And it's just you didn't want to say that at that time. Everyone loves their grandmother, but like looking at that in retrospect, I actually started saying this about 5 or 6 months in. You can't deprive everyone of their senior prom or their first time driving or even their last moments with their grandmother because you're worried about kind of the winged specter of death. That's something that's always existed. I mean, COVID, even
and it's insane.
Yeah. Yeah, the reaction to that risk was insane. Like even at peak, when COVID was 3 to 5 times as dangerous as the flu before the vaccine, that's not all that dangerous. I mean, it would have been entirely possible for us to shelter seniors, like the guys in my neighborhood shop for older ladies in my neighborhood. That was it. You'd show up at the door with some gloves on, give them a bag. Like, it really
And
wasn't all
everyone
that.
goes about their life as normal.
Yes, and that's what they did in Sweden. People were organized, the men's clubs, their equivalent of the junior league, fired volunteer firemen, whatever. They took care of the genuine elder seniors in society, and everyone else just lived. And they ran a risk of death that was about 2x that of the flu, if you adjust for colder climate and healthier people and so on. And some people died, but almost everyone didn't. It was 99.5% survival rate or whatever, just as it was elsewhere. These numbers may be off very slightly. But I mean, I think that was an example of insane behavior caused by a refusal to speak out. Black Lives Matter, which I'm much more expert on than COVID, strikes me as maybe the apex example of this, where every year there are less than 100 unarmed men, 12 to 20 of whom are Black. It's a bit disproportionate, not very much, who are killed by the police in physical fights, this kind of thing. And most of these guys, like, you're technically unarmed if you're trying to run over a cop with an Escalade. Most of these guys are extremely unsympathetic. But from this tiny reality, people generated this idea that there were hundreds or thousands of these police murders every year. Benjamin Crump, who's probably America's leading lawyer, wrote a book called Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People. He said it was a genocide, said the figures in the tens of thousands, if I recall correctly. And everyone just listened and nodded while this crazy nonsense was being said. And again, you and I spoke out. There were a few people that did. But this went on for 2 or 3 years. I mean, this just stopped. Like, we just now have seen crime decrease to where it was in the middle of Black Lives Matter, like before Floyd, but after Freddie Gray and so on. So I think normal people, when they know real things, when they know the crime rate because their brother's a cop or something, need to just say, no, what you're saying is nonsensical. That's a very effective counter to a lot of what we're seeing. And the other option, the other thing to do is to build institutions, the think tanks, alternative colleges, so on.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? Because with education, what you're just basically stating is that we see that it's more about emotion. It's not about reason and logic, being able to think critically and problem solve, which our education system was designed to instill on a student body. Now it's about emotional knee-jerk reactions. And so alternative institutions are good. Unfortunately, when you look at where the grant funding is going by the federal government, a lot of it goes towards these crazy, insane ideas, the diversity, equity, inclusion, multi-billion-dollar industry, and you've noticed changes in your lifetimes. Now, as far as lies my liberal teacher told me, where can everyone get a copy of this book?
I mean, you can, without false modesty, my books have sold pretty well. I've written some obscure academic stuff too, which you can find on Amazon. But the main books, Lies, Hate Crime Hoax, they're all available on Amazon, Walmart, Goodreads. I would recommend buying the book on Amazon unless there's a local bookstore people really want to support, because that's the platform that's used to calculate book sales for authors, as you know. So if you buy on Amazon, I see each time somebody does. And there's almost like a,
you want to get to that number one in that category.
Yeah, but I mean, there is a competitive element to it. Like, I'm number 9 in education right now, but I mean, like, you can see how many you sell, and you can talk to other authors about it. So, and there's a little chart in your Author Central on Amazon. But the book is available pretty much everywhere. The book is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. We also talk about white flight, Native Americans, feminism, a bunch of things you're, quote unquote, not supposed to discuss. And I look forward to people going out and getting that.
Well, we'll have links to the Amazon book on the website and to your X profile so people can follow you. Wilfred, always a pleasure to talk to you. Always enjoy the discussion.
Great talking to you as well, man. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at PAS Report.